Okay, this meeting is called to order at 4:33 online via Zoom on Thursday, June 10th, 2021. We acknowledge that our offices are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. I would like to ask that we have a moment of silence in respect in regards to the horrific news of the discovery of the 215 Aboriginal children discovered the residential school. Okay, thank you, everyone. As for regrets, I have received none, although we are missing one director, Director Shando. Are there any requests to amend the agenda? As I see none, can I get a motion on the table to adopt the agenda as presented? Motion by Director Loachi, seconded by Vice Chair Samudi. Would you like to speak to your motion? Any discussion on the matter? Is there none? All those approve? Director Bothwell?
I approve.
Director Daldrudishe?
I approve.
Director Iqbal?
I approve.
Director Loachi?
I approve.
Director May?
I approve.
Director McCarthy?
I approve.
Director Mohammed?
I approve.
Director Symington?
I approve.
Director Vale?
I approve.
Vice Chair Sneedy?
I approve.
The motion passes with unanimous consent. Before we move on, are there any conflicts of interest to declare? As I see none, we can move on to the approval of the meeting minutes for the April 9th, 2021 meeting, as well as the May 14th, 2021 meeting. Before we go on to the motion, I did receive some messages from directors notifying me of some errors on the meeting minutes for May 14th. So those will be taken into consideration, sent to our board secretary for correction. So we can have a motion to approve the minutes on contingent that those errors will be corrected, if that is okay with everyone. So in that regard, can I have a motion on the table to approve of the 2 meeting minutes pending the correction of those errors? Motion by Director Daldrudishe, seconded by Director Loachi. Would you like to speak to your motion? Any discussion on the matter? As I see none. All those in favor, Director Bothwell,
I approve.
Director Daldrudishe,
I approve.
Director Iqbal,
I approve.
Director Loachi,
I approve.
Director May,
I approve.
Director McCarthy,
I approve.
Director Mohammed,
I approve.
Director Symington,
I approve.
Director Vale,
I approve.
Vice Chair Sneedy.
I approve.
The motion passes unanimous consent, so I'll get in contact with the board secretary immediately after this meeting. Next, moving on to comments from the board, chair of the board and CGO. I have no comments to make other than the fact that I am extremely excited to be able to present our many guest speakers today. And I'm sure that the rest of the board is going to be extremely excited to hear about the insights that they have to provide for everyone else. Other than that, we can move on to the comments from the president and CEO.
Hello, members of the board. Thanks for having me here. So this is my second presidential report. So I'm happy to say that we've met with President Deborah McLachley just to congratulate her on her term. We've been meeting with different members of the administration just to, get my footing in the door and so on, as this is my first month now that has passed. We are asking about in-person O week. We're trying to work with administration to understand how we can best get in-person O-week and events for students. However, we also want to be realistic as to what we can and cannot do. So we are looking for more clarification on that. We are excited to note that we had an 18% increase in enrollment in the first year class. So that is our largest first year class to come to Laurier ever. We presented at VPAC, Erin, my VP of University Affairs, and I, in relations to the removal of lockdown browser for this coming year. And we presented that to the administration. And we've been working with the VP Academics Office for the past year or so. The restorative justice process has begun, as I'm sure many of you are aware, but we are obviously unsure of the end date. And in the past few weeks, unfortunately, we've had to practically make statements in relation to some fairly unfortunate events. So we've been obviously trying to work with administration in making sure students are aware of what resources are available. If there's any questions, those are all my updates as of right now.
Thank you, President Yalnov. Does the board have any questions to the president? Any questions at all? If not, then thank you so much for the updates, President Yamlov. We can move on next to the comments from the Executive Director and COO.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add that wasn't already part of the agenda package, and President Jamalov added on top of that. It is worth noting that we're working with our university partners to better define what the relationship will be with the Navitas College partnership on the Brantford campus, starting as early as the fall of 21. So we are working to figure out what a fee structure will look like and what, for lack of a better term, unofficial representation will look like, and what access those students will have to the much vaunted Laurier student experience. It feels like a very productive conversation so far. So we're looking forward to kind of being able to figure out what that conversation ultimately looks like so that we can provide the board with a brief on exactly how that's going to roll out come the fall and January. And then on top of that, we've most recently met with the region in discussion with regards to the UPass for the GRT for our Waterloo students. And ultimately what that relationship will look like for this upcoming academic year, with the possibility of leading into a referendum question for the future of that program in the winter. Other than that, everything else has been put in front.
Okay, thank you so much. Does the board have any questions to our Executive Director and COO? I have a quick question in regards to the GRT. If that's all right. I want to know, so even though this question will go into referendum, the students will still have access to the bus passes in the fall of 2021. Is that
So
correct?
that's the plan. So before the pandemic, we had agreed to and signed a 1-year extension of the then existing UPass agreement, while we were hoping to be able to get a much more vibrant data package in terms of understanding what Laurier usage of the Grand River Transit System was. And unfortunately, we were never able to actually get that data because the world went flush. And so that 1-year extension got extended. So all signs are pointing to positive on-campus presence for the fall of 21. The hope is that we'll be able to have that data in a very small time frame in preparation for the referendum period. But yes, for the academic year coming up, starting September 1 through April 30th, actually, no, incorrect, August 31st, the UPass will be available to all undergraduate students. And the referendum will speak to that fee, whether it will be assessed in the fall of 22.
Okay, perfect. I have a follow-up question, but I will let the floor go to Director Bothwell first.
I just have a quick question for PJ because I forgot to ask it 2 seconds ago. Is that okay?
That is fine.
Okay. Just about the lockdown browser, does that mean it's like for sure going away, or is it still in discussions?
We were solely there to present the
Okay.
information gathered from Devin's team, because they did run a campaign just gathering evidence from students and their experiences. And so it is up to the the administration how they want to proceed going into the following year.
Okay, cool. I just like thought I like zoned out for a second, so I wanted to make sure. Thanks.
I hope that answered your question. Now, going back to my question, to Phil, in regards to referendum, so if this referendum question does not pass, then effectively does it mean that Lori won't have a bus pass with GRT?
That is correct, yes.
Oh, okay, well, just want to make sure that, because I know that we had this discussion in the previous board, but I just want to make sure the understanding has remained the same. Okay, perfect. Does anyone else have any questions for the executive director or the president if you accidentally missed your opportunity beforehand? Not going once, going twice, and 3 times. Okay, well, thank you so much, Executive Director Phil. Now we can move on to some of our main highlights of the meeting today. So first, I'd like to introduce Director Ivan Joseph from the Office of Student Affairs to come present to us.
Director Ivan Joseph.
I'll take the title. Hi, folks. How are you? Very nice to meet you. For those of you who don't know me, I guess I'm not sure if I can still say I'm new. It's been 8 months or 9 months here. I started in October as your Vice President, Student Affairs. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Presentation is probably maybe a different word. I was here to have a conversation with you about the recent act. I guess it wasn't that so recent, but about the anti-Semitic video that was out there on TikTok that one of our students put out. And so, as you know, that we had a student that put on using social media, one of the channels, some I'll say acts of hate and violence towards a community and a group of individuals. For those of you who haven't seen the video, you know, there were some, I'll say it from my best summary, some gestures with a knife, some burnings of flags, some gestures of just, they were inappropriate and promoted hate and intolerance. When that video was brought to our attention by many students from both, from the students, from faculty members, from members of the Laurier community, from external stakeholders, either via email, via phone call, via Twitter, like we had it all come in, the university got together and I was the spokesperson in terms of the initial response. We put a response out on our Twitter and on our webpage. That the basic message was Wilfrid Laurier University does not condone behaviors that promote hate, induce fear, or threatens people's safety. This type of behavior is unacceptable, and we are committed to creating a culture that is inclusive and safe for everyone. Okay, that was the general message that went out. And then those people who wrote us an email, everybody that wrote us an email, we responded with a similar message. A personal note from myself that had that same templated message. Hello, I'm making up the name Bob. Thank you for bringing this message to our attention. You know, thank you. You know, Wilfrid Laurier does not condone behaviors that promote hate, induce fear, or threaten people's safety. This type of behavior is unacceptable, and we are committed to creating a culture that is inclusive and safe for everyone. At this time, it appears the video has been removed from the account you identified. We are following up on this situation and will take the appropriate action. If you need support, you can reach out to, and then we listed the different levels of support, whether it was the Office of the Dean of Students, Mental Health and Wellbeing on campus, the SOCETI, and I know further on the Deans of Students are going to come and can speak to those supports in detail. When we did that, and at the same time that was happening, we also had reached out to our interfaith Rabbi Moshe to have a conversation about our process and what we were doing. He had reached out to me and I had reached out to him, and we went back and forth talking about how we should approach this and to get his, I'll say, advice is a strong word, but just to have his input as well as what we were doing. And we had several conversations there. You know, he shared with me how the feelings of the campus were, of his campus community and the folks that came to him were feeling unsafe and were feeling attacked and that we needed to have a strong message and a strong message of support. And so we went sure, and he offered to also be a part of our solution by offering some actions, the appropriate actions as well. When we sent that first email to many of the folks, I will say there was a group of people that were still wanting more. They were not happy with that. The message that they wanted to know what the appropriate action was, what the sanctions were, what was happening. And of course, we don't share that with anybody, no matter what the consequence, the sanctions, the things that we are doing here on campus when it involves students. You know, and my message that went out, and I'll read that as I have a copy for it. It was, I'll make it up. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for your follow-up email. Laurier is committed to creating a welcoming and inclusive culture where our diverse community can thrive and individuals feel safe and that they belong. We take all actions that negatively impact our student community seriously and hold those accountable who violate this important principle for Laurier. I can assure you that we are holding the student accountable for the harm they have caused other students and the broader community. We have consulted with our campus and community rabbi to make sure our plan of accountability was appropriate. He was very helpful in validating our approach and offered to help be a part of the solution. Many folks are wanting to know exactly what specific action we are taking against a student. While I understand that desire, our student conduct cases remain closed from public disclosure in order to protect the privacy rights of all those involved. However, I can provide you with some context and information about the process. When a student breaches our non-academic student code of conduct, we take action immediately. This action can result in outcomes that can vary from educational restore sanctions to suspension or expulsion of the students from our university community. This is a difficult time for many in our community, and we are here to help any way we can. Please feel free to reach out directly with any other further questions you may have. The following services and resources are available for all members of our Laurier community if they have experienced racism, hate, or oppression. And I went ahead and listed all of those services. Should you wish to speak to me personally because of your continued connection with a personal call, I would be happy to be available. And so we did then, some of those students then did follow up, and some of those community members and faculty or alumni, whichever ones they were, did want a personal call. And so I followed up personally on a call with each of those as well. I think what's important to note is while we said that if students breach the non-academic student code of conduct, that is not an indication or a validation that this event or activity was a breach of the non-academic student code of conduct. Again, that's not for me to say publicly. It was just for me to outline a process of what happens when those things occur. And so lots of folks want to know, well, was this or was this not? And I don't comment on the public nature of that. I would say for most people, when we went to the follow-up, all probably but one were content with the conversation that we had. And while many of them started, I'll say, tense or heated, the approach was, by the time we got there, we had a mutual sense of understanding and that we were moving in the right direction. As we were doing that, we were also having conversations with the student because, again, the student needed support that was there. This wasn't all just about punishment or sanctions or consequences. There was opportunities for support. We wanted to make sure we reached out to the student and did do what Student Affairs does, which is to make sure that we are connecting and supporting all of our community through this process. We also at the same time reached out to any students that wanted to hear from us and have our support. And that was some students from the Muslim Students Association on both our campuses. And we connected with some of them as well as their person of faith as well to find out how we might support those folks who might be feeling ostracized because there was a strong message or interpretation that our message was all one-sided and was choosing a side in this conversation. And again, the institution's response is that all people are of worth, all people matter. And we were here to support our students and our student community. That is kind of our institutional response. And I'm sure there might be questions, and I'm happy to engage in any of those questions that you might have at this time.
Well, thank you so much for providing a really in-depth information behind what the institution's steps and processes were. I'm sure that this was something that did seem to be vague from the offset when just looking at the statement, but I really do appreciate giving all the detail here. And I do see there's questions. Director Del Giudice.
Thank you very much for your presentation. In terms of addressing potential victims of hateful actions, I'm looking at the student focus initiatives. One of them is to provide culturally competent counseling services and supports for students, including access to racialized and Indigenous counselors, trained in anti-racist and anti-oppression frameworks. The completion is scheduled for spring 2021, and it says there are some delays. Given these delays, are we still on track to implement this by the spring of 2021?
You know, I'm relatively new, friend. Is it Francisco? So I just want to make sure I don't get the answer incorrectly, but to the best of my knowledge, we have hired some counselors in this capacity. I'm not sure if they were both hired, but I think they were both hired, and then we might have had to, somebody may have turned down and we had to hire another. I also know that in our absence of any that were in our, what we'll call our internal shop, that we did reach and connect anybody who wanted one with a racialized or a culturally competent counselor in our community. Again, the deans of students who are coming up later, who've been here much longer than I have, can speak to that with further and greater detail and surety.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Vice Chair Snee.
Thanks, Doctor, for that. I just had a quick question about the video. I believe there were more than one. There was more than one student in the video. Was that second student, if you can speak to it, a Laurier student, or were you just was it just the one who might have posted it or shared it?
We were dealing only with the student that posted or shared a video that was a Laurier student.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? If not, then I would like to also ask a question to Dr. Joseph. So the process that you outlined, this is something that the school would have taken regardless of what the situation was, right? Like this is kind of like the general standardized process that that the institution would do. So there was no at all, you know, to kind of reiterate your point, like one side getting a bit of favoritism over another, right?
Yeah, I can say, I mean, as I'm new and I can't speak to the precedent that Laurier has taken in the past. I think we followed a precedent or starting to establish a precedent of how we would act and move. I think probably if I, you know, again, as we move through this and know the role of the student union and my role in the deans of students, there would probably be a step there where I would have had a conversation with the university student body president. That's probably as we go through this, it's like, what could we have done a little bit different or better? That's probably the one step that we would add, but I think as we would move forward, it's whether this was, you know, for lack of a better word, a racist man on campus spewing anti-racist or racist terminology to Black people, we would do the exact same thing.
Yeah, no, I do appreciate that because I know that this is something that's also new that the board is dealing with, and we're just trying to figure out what's the best way to also address this. While keeping in mind with like transparency, but as you say, the confidentiality piece as well.
Yeah, and your question is like we had the conversation as well, and you know, Phil and I had a conversation about the process with PJ and Ellen. And again, as we move, as everybody is new and we're new relationships, it's how do we look to improve it? Wasn't about finger pointing. It was just like, hey, how do we do it better?
And I'm not too sure if you are the best person to speak about this, but will this at all kind of like affect what the outcome of the strategic plan is, or would that be more for Barrington?
That would be more for Barrington. I'm a partner in there, but it's more my partnership is more for input. He's the pen to that.
Yeah. But if you have but do you know of any news if that will kind of change what the framework and structure of it will be, or not particularly so?
Yeah, I would imagine that this would not change the structure of the framework. That process is a very inclusive process that takes into account how we create a more welcoming and inclusive piece. It's not, that plan isn't about punishments or sanctions. It's about making sure people feel like they matter and they belong. And how do we proactively drive initiatives that make sure that that is true and not just in words.
I know, perfect guy, because I just know that the concern of students were that is there confidence that actions have been taken. I think based on your response, I think no one can deny that the university has taken appropriate actions, and it's making sure that we keep all the students on campus safe. But on that note, does any other directors have any questions for Dr. Joseph? If not, then I would really like to thank him thank you, Ivan, for your time to presenting SIBOR. I know that you have a very busy schedule, and I'm sure that we all took some additional insight into what the behind the scenes process were, which hopefully will help guide our decisions in the future. So
pleasure to be here, Director Dang, and may I just send a message to all of the directors and people on the board. But if there are any questions or concerns or anything that you want to bring to my attention, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. It doesn't have to be a formal process. I'm happy to respond, and I'm happy to be here to serve the needs of the students. Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much. I guess we can give a round of applause for him virtually online.
Take care, folks.
Have a great day. Thank you. So great presentation by Dr. Ivan Joseph. And now we can move on to a little bit of a different topic, but nonetheless important presentation on the financial background for our directors by our very own Director of Finance, Chris Turner.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will share with all of you if someone can enable.
It's set up for you.
Okay.
You should have access.
Yeah, no, we're good.
Awesome.
So typically with the board, year over year, there's anywhere from maybe a minimum of 1 to 2 people that have some background in finance accounting to kind of a max of half the board. But most years it's no more than 3 or 4 people. So typically the financial strength of the board is a little lacking, for lack of a better term. And that's why we've been doing this the last few years, just to give each of you a bit of background about some things that I imagine most of you aren't that familiar with. So feel free to interrupt with questions whenever you want, or after, or later next week if you think of anything. Each of you are free to email me or ask me questions whenever you like. And this shouldn't take too long, because I don't want to overwhelm you guys with too much data and information. So what I want to go through today is why you need to look at the money that comes in and goes out for the student union. Just briefly touch on your responsibility under policy governance. I want to talk about the budget process, and I also want to talk about the monitoring process for our financial outcomes. So as a board, what are you looking for? You want to make sure the organization has good financial health, that we have a sound balance sheet, that we have a balanced budget, that we have positive cash flow, and you want to ask questions and analyze potential business risks. And I'll talk to each one of those points as we move through this. So some key definitions, and as I said, most of you are probably not finance accounting students. And if you are, bear with me, but these are important definitions to know, because these things come up multiple times over the course of the year. So the first one is amortization or depreciation. And those two terms can be used for the purposes of this fairly interchangeably. And basically all that is a non-cash expense that we recognize every year. So when we go out and purchase, I don't know, a box of envelopes for the office and we pay somebody money, that's a cash expense. It shows up as an expense, but there's also cash that went out the door to pay for it. When you record amortization or depreciation expense, you're still booking an expense, but there's no cash going out the door. So for example, if we buy a new van for foot patrol and we spend $50,000 on that van, the year in which we buy that van, we will cut a check for $50,000 and send it to the dealership. However, that isn't expensed. What happens is that we've estimated that the useful life of that van is 5 years, and with some of the student drivers we've had in the last few years, that could be questionable. But that aside, we're assuming that van's going to last 5 years. So what we do over the lifetime of that van is we book $10,000 in expense, in depreciation expense each year for 5 years. The reason I bring up that definition is that when we're looking at audited statements, every year we have a fairly large amortization or depreciation expense that typically takes us into an overall deficit position for the year end. However, I don't want people to get too worried about it because it's a non-cash expense. So that's why I bring that one up. The second definitions are debt versus deficit. So, and these people sometimes get confused on these ones. So debt is money that's owed to a loaner over a long, typically long period of time. So for example, right now, the student union has about roughly $2.8, $2.9 million in debt. And half of that debt we owe to the World Bank, half of that debt we owe to the university, and that debt is to be paid down. Initially, most of those loans were set up to be paid down over 20-year, 15-year timeframes. Deficit, on the other hand, is when you either budget or at the end of the year, your financial results demonstrate that you're in a deficit position. And that's basically when you spend more money than what you bring or what you receive in a year. So you finish the year in a deficit position. So if we budgeted and received $10 million in revenue, but we ended up spending and expensing $10.2 million, then we finished that year in a $200,000 deficit. So that's important to keep those two definitions clear, because both of those will come up multiple times over the course of your year on the board. And the next couple of definitions, a balance sheet or a statement of financial position. And I do this, and a lot of financial people do this. People will flip back and forth what they call the document. And they're basically a balance sheet or a statement of financial position are the same thing. They just show your assets and liabilities of the organization at a certain period of time. So if you hear me call something a balance sheet, and then the next time I call it a statement of financial position, same thing. Same with an income statement or a statement of operations. That's basically a statement that shows your revenue and expenses and your net surplus or deficit over a time frame of a month, a year, 6 months, whatever it is you're looking at. Again, those two terms are interchangeable. So important to know those definitions. They will come up again and again throughout the year. Here's a little bit of a summary of our student union debt. So if you look at the first column here, the original amount borrowed, this goes back to the first loan was September 2010. And if you look at, there's 2 RBC loans and there's 2 amounts that we borrowed from the university. And the sum of all the money we borrowed, so at the peak of our debt, we had about $6.8 million in debt. And that debt was incurred for a number of different reasons. We used debt to build the Brantford Student Center, the food court that's attached to the Fred Nichols Campus Center. We used debt to build that addition to the building. There was a flood in Wilf's Restaurant going back a decade ago. And while insurance covered a lot of that, we also had to pay for some of the renovations ourselves. So debt was used for that. The 2-4 lounge enhancement, debt was used for that. And at one point, the demand loan in 2013, at that time, the student union was, for lack of a better terms, a little bit in over its head financially. And the university had to step in and provide us with a little bit of money just for the purposes of continuing and carrying on our operations. And that particular loan has a lot of criteria and requirements attached to it. But again, it's something that we needed at the time. So the good news with all that is this column, the current balance, and this was at the start of May, was a little over $3 million. We just made, and the board had approved this, and, or was made aware of this because Phil brought this forward and the last board saw that. We made a $200,000 one-time payment against this demand loan that isn't represented in the numbers. And that's why when I said our current loans are about 2.8 million. And these are the important things that, as a board member. So every month to service this debt, which is our principal and interest payments, either back to the university or to the Royal Bank, we spend $44,000. And if you add that up over the course of the year, we spend over $500,000 on principal and interest payments for our loans. So our goal, and you can see in this last column when these loans are expected to be fully paid down, we would like to accelerate those to the best of our ability, because as you can all imagine, how much nicer it would be to have $500,000 every year that we could now devote to some other initiative, program, building, refurbishment, whatever it is. And we will get there, because as I said, we were originally at 6.8 million and now we're down under 3 million. And this demand loan that we just paid $200,000 against, it originally had an end date of January of 2026. By making that $200,000 payment, we've now reduced that down to November of 2024. So when I first got here 8 years ago and I looked at all this debt, and it just seemed like it was never going to be paid down. We've kind of reached a point now where you can, for a couple of them anyway, you can see the end of the line coming, not too far out in the distant future. And what we would like to do this year as well is make an additional one-time payment against that loan, but we'll wait to see where we're sitting further in the year before we decide what we want to do. So that's our debt. So just briefly, I won't go into those. I don't know if you've already talked about these as part of your board training, but under policy governance, I've just listed the ELs and the GP that you have responsibility for, EL2D, EL2E, GP2K, and these are looking at conditions and activities, planning and budgeting, and governance, financial accountability. So those are going to come up again during the year on multiple occasions. So as a board, you have fiduciary duty.
Oh,
And
sorry, Chris.
basically-
So,
Yeah.
one thing I just want to quickly point to the board to give some more information about those ELs is that the first two ELs is going to be the ones that the finance committee looks at, which is kind of like so those two ones, 2D and 2E are the most important ones. So if I know that some directors might not have the greatest patience for the finance, but these are one of the most important things that help govern pretty much what Chris is going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation. personally, it's my favorite committee too as well, so I have a little bit of a bias. Apologies for the interruption.
Thanks for that. So as I said, you have a fiduciary duty, which is basically, you have to act in the best interests of the students you represent, and you've been entrusted with the care of the financial resources of the organization on the student's behalf. And we'll get in a little bit more of the magnitude of that. So you need to look at high level issues, and those are risk, cash flow. If we wanted to introduce a new program, what would the financial implications of that be? As a board at the level you're at, you shouldn't be digging into the weeds and doing line by line reviews. If Foot Patrol wants to buy new jackets, and so the board spends a lot of time arguing, well, why are you spending $200 per jacket when you can get this other one for $165 per jacket? That's not really the level that the board needs to be operating at. And I'll show you a bit more on that as we look at some of our numbers. So I think you'll find this interesting. If you look at our annual picture, and this is an overview of our revenues. For the current year, our budget is about $11.5 million in revenues. And that's up over $1 million from previous years, primarily because, as you all recall, there was a referendum question that was just passed to increase the health plan fee by $75 per student who are enrolled in that plan. And when you multiply $75 per student times about roughly 12,500 students who are enrolled in the plan, that's almost $1 million right there. So when you look at our pie here, you see the biggest chunk of the revenue that we get is a little over $4 million for the health and dental plan. The fees that each of you pay as students are about $3.3 million. So that's the Fred Nichols Campus Center fee, or the Brantford Student Center fee, or the health and wellness fee, or the programming fee, et cetera, et cetera. Hospitality, which is Wilf's Restaurant, our catering services, and Golden Grounds in Brantford will bring in, we've budgeted to bring in about $2.6 million this year in revenue. And that's a little bit lower than what it normally is. It's normally over $3 million. However, with COVID, we've backed off on that for this current year. So I think that's probably a surprise to a lot of you that Wilf's brings in typically over $3 million in revenue in a year. And then I've just lumped everything else into other. So that's, we lease out the food court to Aramark, so they pay us money for that space. We rent lockers to students. When we sell tickets for programming, donations that we get that we ultimately turn over for Shinorama, for example, money we get from the poster sales, et cetera, et cetera. When you add all those up, that's another $1.5 million. So that's kind of a picture of where our money comes from every year. And then if we look at where our money goes, so our expenses, I've added a few more slices into the pie, but you'll see the biggest chunk of our expenses goes to our health and dental plan. So on the revenue side, we bring in all this money in premiums, but then we spend all that money that we get, we basically pay it all out in claims for the claims that are put in by the students. Then the second biggest chunk is wages, which is a little bit less than 3 million, about 2.9 million. And those are the wages for all of the full-time staff, the student executive. And in a normal year, a non-COVID year, so the last year isn't a good example, but in a normal year, we have employed somewhere between 150 to 200 students that work at Wilf's or Golden Grounds or at the U desk. And that's what it costs to in salaries and wages and benefits for all of our employees. I've highlighted a small chunk here, which is just so you guys can see debt, and this is just the principal component of the debt, 456,000 we're paying out in debt. The interest is actually in this other section. And then the food that we sell at Wilf's or Golden Grounds or through catering is, we spend over $1 million a year just on food purchases. And then the big chunk here, other, that's everything else. That's custodial, all the program fees when we contract out a musical act. It's our insurance, it's our office supplies, it's travel, it's all the programming that we do, it's all the costs for putting on orientation week. Everything is lumped in that 3 million. So this little number here I have at the bottom, and I just picked $650 out of the air. But again, when I was talking about, if the board spends half an hour debating about spending $200 on a foot patrol jacket versus $165, if you think about, if you guys are arguing or concerned over $650, well, that shows you what percent that is of our overall budget. So just kind of keep that in mind when you guys are asking questions and where you should spend your valuable time during the course of the year. So what I'm going to talk about now is the budget process. So these two slides that I just showed you, these are the budgets for the current year that were approved by the previous board. You as a board will need to approve the following year's budget, and you're going to do that typically in April. So the budget process is student managed and staff managed. It's for both Waterloo and Brantford, and obviously there's a lot of crossover expenses and revenues. It's typically started in January and approved by the board in April. So we've got 30 to 45 individual departments that we budget for. And within each of those departments, there's multiple lines of revenues and expenses. And we all collect all that information, and I put it all together and I bring it to the board, and you guys will approve that budget next year at some time. And the reason it's done that way is that we like the board that's had a year's experience looking at our organization to approve the budget, rather than the new board that's just coming in fresh, doesn't really know what's going on yet. And we don't want to put that big responsibility on a brand new board. So what are the budget challenges? And I've listed a few here for this current year that we're in, and a lot of them are related to COVID. So what we struggled with in building the budget is, to what extent are we back on campus in the fall, and how closely will our return be to normal? And obviously that impacts our revenues and our expenses. So for example, what about hospitality? Will we be limited to takeout dining options for Wilf's? Will there be in-person seating? Will we have limited hours for Golden Grounds in Brantford? Also, loss of revenue from poster sales, locker rentals, commissions, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, to what extent is O Week in person? So this year, probably, well, actually the last couple of years there's been a lot of unknowns. Before COVID came along, where there was the whole student choice initiative, where some of our revenues students were able to opt out on for one particular year. So when we get around to building the budget for next year, there's going to be a whole bunch of challenges associated with that budget that I will bring forward, and PJ will bring forward, or Brooke as the VP of Finance, and we'll bring all those forward so that you as a board can see what challenges were included in next year's budget, so you can ask the appropriate questions based on those challenges. And then finally, we're going to look at our monitoring process. So after the end of every fiscal year, our auditors from KPMG come in and they audit the financial results for the year that just ended. So they're typically on site in August, going through all our records. And then we would bring a draft audited statement to the board at some point in October. Now, last year, because of COVID and no one was allowed on site, we didn't bring those draft statements to the board. Andrew, I can't remember when it was. I think it might have been February before they finally came last year. And that was a little delayed, but
Was
we're
very
hoping
late.
to be, yeah, we're hoping to be back on track this year with our results. And again, that's one of the referendum questions that the student body has to approve the auditors every year, and they've approved KPMG again for next year. And just quickly, I'll run you through an example of what the audited financial statements could potentially look like. And this is just a year from, well, we're almost 7 or 8 years ago now. So here again, we're looking at the statement of operations, which can also be called the income statement. And you'll see back in 2014, our revenue was about 9.2 million. Expenses were 8.5. So we had a surplus from operations of 680,000. But as I talked about earlier, with amortization expense, we had a large amortization expense back here of 897,000. So that expense pushed us primarily into a deficit position for the year of a little over $400,000. But again, I don't want the board to get to freak out because that amortization expense is a non-cash expense. So back at that point in time, it didn't impact our cash position. The balance sheet, or as it's labeled here, the statement of financial position. So this lists all our assets, which is your cash, your accounts receivable, your inventories, etc. And then it also lists your liabilities, which things are like your accounts payable, your debt. There's a current portion of debt and a long-term portion of debt, and then your equity. So that's your balance sheet. There's a statement of cash flows, which I won't get into because it's really complicated, but it basically shows where your cash comes from and where it's used for operations, for financing and investing. Those are kind of the big three statements. But again, you won't see this until probably October when we bring the audited statements for last fiscal year to the board for approval. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was our cash flow. So what cash flow is it's kind of an art and a science where I'm always thinking a year out in advance where our money's coming from and where our money's going. So I make sure that we have enough money in the bank to meet all our obligations, because we don't ever want to end up in a position where we can't make payroll or we can't pay a bill because we don't have enough money. So I'm always looking a year out into the future to make sure we've got enough money. Now you'll see in this particular year, and what this is like an example from back in 15, 16, at certain points of the year, we're flush with cash, and then it goes down, 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 and then we get a big influx of cash, and then it goes down, 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 and then we get, so that's how the student union operates, because most of our money comes in big lump sums, and that we get our fees and our health and dental money at certain discrete times during the year. And then we get that lump sum at the start of a semester, and then that has to kind of keep us afloat until the next time money comes in. So similar to each of you that might have a summer job, so that when you start school in September, your bank account looks pretty good, but by the time the following April rolls around, it might be getting a little dicey of how much money you've got left. Then you start your summer job again and it goes back up and you're all set for the following fall. So I keep a very close eye on this cash flow to make sure we're always above zero, and I'm always looking a year out in advance. And as of right now, we're in a very good position, because as bad as the last previous year was, we didn't have a lot of outflow of cash because there wasn't a lot going on. So our cash position, like I think as of yesterday, we had over $3.8 million, I think, in our main account. So we're pretty solid right now from a cash flow position, and we should be good for this year. So I will leave it at that because that's a lot of information for all of you, and I don't want to overwhelm you too much, but it's a very important topic and something that you as members of the board need to grasp at a high level, but you need to grasp it nonetheless. So I'll open it up now for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Chris Turner. So now going to the gallery, I see Director Vale.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Chris. No, thank you very much for the informative presentation. I guess just a quick question, as I know that I found out a while ago being on Senate, but I believe it was released the other day publicly. But given that we're seeing an increasing, significant increase in enrollment at the university, do you anticipate that this is going to have like a significant positive cash flow to us as an organization, and then that might help to mitigate any risks associated with the uncertainties related to COVID, if you will, in terms of in-person and all those sort of uncertainties at this time?
Yeah, absolutely it will, because one of our assumptions that we use when we build our budget is that we don't assume that we're going to have a big enrollment increase like that. So if it doesn't happen and enrollment is flat, then we've budgeted accordingly. So for this current year, we budgeted the same enrollment as the previous year, but now with this 18% uptake, that means a lot more in student fees that we'll be receiving that is a bonus to the organization. So that does help. However, that also means that there's a little bit more money for each of those additional 18% worth of students going out the door for orientation week, for programming, potentially for some of the services that we offer. So while it does mean more money, it also means a little bit more in expenses. But at the end of the day, the net impact of that is beneficial to us for sure.
Thank you very much.
I hope that answers your question. Is there any other directors who have questions? Yes, Vice Chair Snee.
Quick question. You mentioned how much money Wilfs brings in. Is Wilfs also also the UDesk, or is the UDesk its own separate entity here?
The UDesk is its own separate entity, and we do a separate budget for the UDesk. It has its own student staff that are managed by Kelly Lee, who's one of our other directors. And I think there's probably, I can't know that, don't quote me on this, but there's 8 or 9 students employed here in Waterloo and 3, 4, 5 students employed at the UDesk in Brantford. And yes, they're responsible for their own budget.
Does that answer your question, Vice Chair Snee?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Are there any other questions? As I see none so far, I have a couple of questions. You mentioned all the way back in one of your earlier slides that the SU made like a one-time payment of their loan back to RBC. Yes. Was that in relation to the surplus we had, or was that a different?
So that, just to clarify, that loan repayment was to the university, okay, not RBC. Because the university has said whenever we have any extra money, we can throw it down on the loan, and they're not going to charge us any penalties or fees for doing that, where the bank probably would. So our ability to pay that that one-time $200,000 payment on the loan was a result of the surplus that you saw when you sat on the board last year. So we had some extra cash that we hadn't originally anticipated having. Rather than having it just sit in the bank, we used it to pay down that loan. And we've done that before in previous years, but never to that magnitude. In the past, it's often been 50,000 or 75,000, never 200 that we were able to do this year.
But that is, no, that I just want to make sure, and that's very reassuring to know that that was the decision that was made based on the surplus. A second question, this is more for a broader, to all, an answer to, I guess, the rest of the board. For the directors who are not, as I guess, financially, like, inclined in terms of, like, enjoying this information, what would be your recommendation? Like, if they, when they receive the budget and the reports later on in our term, like, what do we, what would they recommend? Sorry, what would you recommend for them to look at? I know you gave the example of the $200 jacket.
So I think, so say we brought forward a budget and in it, it had a new program that projected X amount in revenue, and it would operate at a balanced position, and it would be good moving forward. So the types of questions I would ask as a board member are, well, what's the feasibility of actually receiving that revenue and making this new program financially viable? How aggressive were you as a operating team in making those revenue assumptions? Was it fairly conservative, or are you kind of reaching for the sky and you have two fingers crossed that you can actually achieve these numbers? So the question that was asked about the enrollment, in next year's budget, if we came forward to the board and said, well, we had an 18% increase in enrollment last year, so this year we're projecting a 20% increase in enrollment, and we've assumed those revenues will follow suit. Well, you as a board could say, well, you know what, how realistic is that 20%? Maybe that 18% that we just saw was kind of a one-off, never to be repeated. So as a board, maybe we're not comfortable with you assuming a 20% increase, and maybe we should just go back to assuming enrollment will be flat. So that's kind of the high level questioning. Even things as simple as, well, when you built this budget, what are the biggest risks that you see over the course of the following year that could negatively impact the results that you've projected? Because we saw what happened with COVID. So that could be, maybe student choice initiative comes back and people can opt out of some of the fees. So that's kind of the level I think that the board should be operating at.
Okay, no, that is, I think, some great insight. Thank you so much for that answer. Is there any other questions? As I still see none, I'd like to thank our Director of Finance, Chris Turner, for presenting us this background to the entirety of the board. Again, I think a round of applause is in order virtually.
Thanks, everyone. And like I said, you guys, if you want to email me or reach out to me whenever you want, I'm happy to answer anybody's questions on the student union money. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you for your time, Chris.
All right. Bye.
Now moving on to another highlight of our agenda tonight, I'd like to welcome and give a warm invitation to Dr. Al-Mustafa to come, who's volunteered time to come present to the board on some really interesting and contentious topics for us tonight. So I'd like to hand it off to you now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm so happy to see familiar faces. I think I know more than half of the board, like, which feels kind of like familiar.
It is a small world, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, thank you very much for having me tonight. Having students here that were part of my Middle Eastern politics class, I think some of the things that I will talk about will be repetitive, but it's always great to remind people about the right context and the historical kind of like picture of of these events that are related to the Palestinian-Israeli issue, because we cannot understand those events and their impact on people if we don't understand the historical kind of like context of the event. So I think, as many of you were aware of what happened in Israel and occupied Palestinian territories during the month of May, the tragic results were more than 256 people being killed in Gaza, including 67 children, and 13 people being killed in Israel, including 2 children. These tragic events were actually a result and a consequence of other events that happened in other parts of the Palestinian occupied territories, which was mainly Jerusalem and eastern part of Jerusalem, when settlers invaded the Al-Aqsa Mosque and kind of like triggered sentiments of anger between the prayers, and then the Israeli forces prevented Palestinians from Al-Aqsa Mosque and preventing them from going there to pray. At the same time, dozens of families in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem were and still actually threatened of being evicted from their homes. And at the moment, they are going through a trial facing another Jewish institutions that claim the ownership of those houses, whereas these families are Palestinian refugees who've been forcibly displaced from their homes when Israel's state was established in 1948. And they were offered to live in these houses in East Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, another area in East Jerusalem. They were offered to live in these houses by UNRWA, and they were promised at that time that they will be provided by official document to prove their rights of staying on these houses. But because of the war of 67, the Jordanian government, who was responsible for issuing these documents for those refugees, they did not provide them with those documents, and refugees lived in these houses for all this time without official documents that prove their rights of like inhabiting these houses. And now we see settlers coming and invading these neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and trying and attempting, actually not trying, like they are working hard to push for Palestinian families outside these houses in order to strengthen the Jewish existence and limiting the Palestinian existence in these neighborhoods. So the conflict about East Jerusalem and the existence of Palestinian families and the conflict with those settlers have been there for decades, and we have to understand as I said, the historical development of these events and understand how we manage to reach this moment where the cycle of violence is actually expected to happen again and again and again, because at the end, on the ground, nothing had changed. And I know that the media is at the moment, I mean, the mainstream media is at the moment not providing people outside or people who are not following the news, particular news, they are not you with headlines about what's going on the ground. But I am following, other people are following, and things are still at the same level of tension. People who were trying to defend their houses, defend their families, being detained by Israeli forces, trying to silence them, to prevent them from advocating for their rights, and at the same time, people who are trying to press or to talk about what's going on the ground are being silenced by different tools, especially in our kind of like Western world. So I don't know, I wanted to have kind of like an engaging discussion because I think most of the people who open their cameras have listened to my presentation and the slides that I shared with you, Andrew, before this meeting. But I said during our meeting together that I will use these slides as kind of like the basis for my discussion. And I'm happy to share the screen, but at the same time, I'm more than happy to talk about what happened to the Palestinians and to Palestine, the historical Palestine and the establishment of Israel, and why this cycle of violence is expected to go on and on and on. But before I start the discussion or talk about even my slides, I would like to highlight the importance of using the right terminology here. And I think, Andrew, we discussed that during our meeting, but I always remind my students, and I think it's very important for us, if we want to really understand what's going on, is to use the right terminology. And this is why, if you notice that I don't use the word, or try to avoid using the word conflict, because we are not talking about symmetric power relation here. We are talking about a state that represent a model of security state, whereas the other part of the issue are the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are divided into 3 categories. So after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the Palestinian people who used to live in historical Palestine ended up to be a group of Palestinians, about 100,000 people, who refused to leave and forcibly be displaced outside their homes, are now citizens of the State of Israel. And we will talk about whether they are full citizens or they are second-hand citizens. So they are subject to, as the Human Rights Watch confirmed, they are subject to apartheid regime within the State of Israel. The second category are the people who are living in occupied territories of West Bank and in Gaza, which is under a full blockade by the Israeli forces since 2005. And the third category are the Palestinian refugees, and we are talking about refugees who've been through multiple forced displacement. First in 1948, when they were forced to leave their homeland when Israel was established as a state, and then they went to areas in the region like Lebanon, Syria, West Bank and Gaza, Iraq and Egypt. For example, and we studied that in the course, as many of you remember, those who left and went to Syria during the Syrian conflict, which started in 2011, they were forced to go through another wave of forced displacement. And the reason for this vulnerability is because the state of Israel, which is responsible for and is being responsible for their statelessness and forced displacement, denies their right of return, which being internationally recognized by the UN according to the resolution 194. So the Palestinians are subject to different layers of denial. They are denied to have their own national narrative as a nation, and this is conducted by the State of Israel. They are denied to have their self-determination. They are denied their right of return, and they are denied full right of citizenship within the State of Israel. So if you want, I can use the slides. If just give me the right to share my slides.
Yeah, I think it'll be a great opportunity to, like, even though there's a lot of students,
Okay.
here who have been. I think it'll be just great to have a refresher for those who haven't been in your class before, or even
No
some of the
problem.
guests in our gallery too as well.
No problem at all.
Then,
So
and then
can you see the
afterwards we
slides
have,
now?
yeah, perfect. And then afterwards we can have the time for that engaging discussion, because I'm sure there's students who have questions, including myself.
Okay, great. Can you see the slides now? Yeah. Okay. So let me go. So as I said, that many people consider so complex, and they connect it to religious nature, whereas many scholars and the fact and the historical development and events proven that this is a territorial conflict rather than a conflict about religion or a conflict between Muslims and Jews, because historical Palestine, which was a part of the Ottoman Empire and then came under the British mandate before being moved to be the State of Israel, used to have Muslim communities, Christian communities, and small Jewish communities who generally lived in peace and harmony before the establishment of the State of Israel. So if we want to go back to the claims within this issue, we have the Jewish claims that are based on biblical promises, and also after the events of the Second World War, and actually before, the Jewish claims focused on providing the Jewish people a safe haven to escape the European anti-Semitism that caused Holocaust events later on. Whereas for the Palestinians, they are considered the indigenous people who lived on the land of historical Palestine for thousands of years, generation after generation, and they feel that they are not responsible to compensate for the Jewish people from Europe for the European anti-Semitic actions that being conducted against them. Some scholars define this conflict as a conflict between two nations or two groups who are fighting for their right of self-determination, whereas other scholars, and those are mainly Israeli historians and Israeli activists, progressive scholars, they believe that it's not about self-determination, but it's rather of settler colonial plan that was conducted by the Zionist movement on the land of Palestine and against the Palestinians, based on this notion of exclusive entitlement, where the Zionist movement was aiming to have as much land of Palestine with less Palestinian people. And that led to what we call, and what many scholars call, the ethnic cleansing operation of the Palestinians. And if we go back to 1914, during the First World War, the population and demographic fabric of Palestine at that time, which was still under the Ottoman Empire, if you look at the number, like more than 683 people were Arab Palestinians, and there was a small community of Jews, like around 60,000. And we have to remember that those Jews are, a number of them are indigenous Palestinian Jews, and the other are like settlers who moved to Palestine at the beginning of that century. We studied in the course that Britain was very much involved in the historical development of Palestine. Britain was involved in a number of double dealings during that period, because they were trying to have as much allies and win the First World War. So they promised the Arabs of having their own Arab kingdom that kind of like expand from Saudi Arabia all the way to the borders of Turkey. So Palestine was included if they revolt against the Ottomans. And at the same time, they were involved in Sykes-Picot agreement with the French and the Russians before the Bolshevik Revolution, where they divided the Levant between them and the French in particular. And Palestine was planned to be under their own control. And during also the same period, they were involved in issuing what is known as Balfour Declaration, which provided an announcement of the British support for establishing a Jewish national home in the territories of Palestine. In 1917, Palestine came under the British mandate. And during that time, Palestine witnessed massive Jewish immigration from Europe, and that increased the democratic existence of Jewish communities within the state, within the territories of Mandate Palestine. The Arabs started having their own grievances because of the British mandate authority way of controlling their own lives, and the oppression, and also the biased politics by the British mandate authorities towards the Zionist communities and the Jewish settlers who were increasingly moving to that area. A cycle of violence happened, and we remember that there was an Arab revolt in 1936. And during the years after that, hostilities increased between the Palestinians from that one side against the British and the settlers, and between the British and the settlers and the Zionist militia on the territories of Palestine. In 1947, the British decided to take the file of Palestine to the UN, who came with the plan of we call it the partition plan, where they offered the Palestinian 56% of their whole land, and they offered the Jewish with 43%. The Palestinian definitely refused that plan, but the Israeli accepted it. But later on, the Israeli forces were continuingly working on securing more land and ethnically cleanse more Palestinians from the land, reaching May 1948, when Britain evacuated Palestine and Israel was declared as the state. That was the year where Palestinian considered as al-Nakba, the catastrophe, because more than 780,000 to 800,000 Palestinian people became refugees, as I explained earlier. And Palestine itself was divided into 3 regions. 77% was under the Israeli control, and it presented the state of Israel. West Bank and East Jerusalem on one side were controlled by Jordan, and Gaza came under the control of Egypt. In 1967, Israel occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, in addition to parts of Syrian Golan Heights and Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. During the same period, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, was established as a representative of the Palestinian people in their struggle to liberate their own land. And when I said that West Bank and Gaza came under the occupation, that occupation consisted of a governmental structure related to military administratives and laws, which denied basic rights for Palestinians and subjected them to collective punishment and imprisonment, which created another level of grievances. During the same time, continuing their plans of having more land with less people, the Israelis continued to build settlements on those occupied territories. And that led after a few years of that led to the first Intifada, which was a popular movement by the Palestinian, mainly within the West Bank and Gaza, against the occupation authority of Israel. During the same period, the PLO was involved in secret negotiation. And in 1993, we had Oslo Accords, which was aiming to create what we call a conflict resolution, rather than having a fair and just resolution for the whole thing. And because it did not provide answers for the big questions of the conflict, another Intifada or popular movement happened in 2000. And in November 2012, the Palestinian Authority that was established according to Oslo Accord in certain areas in West Bank was accepted as a non-member observer at the United Nations. So these are the points I wanted, like the historical points that I wanted to remind people of, and at the same time to bring to the discussion in order for us to understand why this cycle of violence is happening and is predicted to happen, just because the big questions about the Palestinian right of self-determination, rights of return, and rights of citizenships are still denied by the Israeli authorities. So I will stop here and welcome any question you may have for me.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Al-Mustafa. Do we have any questions? Yes, Director Loachi.
Hi, Dr. Al-Mustafa. I just wanted to start by thanking you for coming in today. So my question to you is, there's been a strong opposition growing against Benjamin Netanyahu. In what ways do you think that's going to impact the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, the situation of Benjamin Netanyahu is very much related to what happened on the ground in the month of May, because we had a prime minister who's having lots of issues, including accusations of corruption, and he was trying to maintain his position as a prime minister. And as you know, at the moment he almost leaving. So he was he's pushing everything to the edge in order to maintain his position as a prime minister. How I see things developing and what are the kind of like the development of the political situation in Israel, I'm not optimistic, because the options that are at the moment on the table are more right-wing. People who like the two names who are at the moment suggested to share the government in Israel are people who are extremists, kind of like right wing. They deny the Palestinian rights of having their even their own state, or having their rights. And even that, which is very ironic, that we had a group of Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel that being successful in having number of sites of seats within the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. They are creating a coalition with this far right movement, but at the same time they are non-representative of the Palestinian people, because at the end Palestinian people need a movement that can represent their rights, and I don't think this this coalition will provide them with a good representation.
Thank you for answering my question.
No problem, Kiana.
Perfect.
Ezra.
How are you, Professor? It's so great to see you.
Great to see you, Ezra.
So I have two quick questions.
Sure.
The first one is, unfortunately, in this day and age, there's a lot of manipulation of facts and manipulation of what people want to see. So as an academic yourself, are there any sources that you recommend specifically for information regarding this issue?
Yeah, there are lots of informations. For example, there are certain networks that are trying to spread the word about what's going on, like Al-Haq is one organization. I am happy to provide the board with a list of organizations that can be distributed. We have Jadaliya, it's a number of scholars who have Palestinian and progressive Israeli scholars who are very active trying to create awareness of what's going on the ground. We have Adala Center inside Israel that are very active with protecting the legal rights of Palestinians who are subject to abuses of their rights and subject to detention in the Israeli police centers. So yeah, I'm happy to provide you with a list of networks that can offer you with information from right sources.
I think that would be very much appreciated.
Okay.
Maybe that's something I can run by the chair, whether it be now or after this meeting.
Okay.
For sure, I can follow up with Professor Mustafa
Perfect.
and circulate to the rest of the board. Absolutely, 100%.
And my second question is, I think a lot of people throughout, when what happens in the Middle East, when they see it, often becomes a point of conversation, right? It dominates the news media, and people talk about obviously what's in the news. What do you say to people who either don't want to talk about it, or maybe just don't know enough and sort of feel that if they don't say anything, their friends might feel that they're being complicit or whatever? Like, what do you say to people who feel they might be getting dragged into this when they really don't want to be?
Yeah, this is a great question, Ezra, because actually I've been faced with this during the month of May and before, but during the events, many of even my progressive colleagues try to avoid talking about what's going on the ground. And at the same time, other people, every time we mention the violence and the oppression of people on the ground, they say this is too complicated, I don't want to get involved in this. I have to say that it's ignorance in this case is a choice, and it's not justified the choice, right? Because you are talking about oppressive regimes conducting abuses of human rights. Some of the conducts and some of the actions reach to the level of war crimes or crimes against humanity. So we cannot keep ourselves closed eyes or put our head in the sand just because we don't want to get involved. And I have to say, some people being silenced because there is a culture of terrorism, intellectual terrorism, that the minute you start talking about this issue, and I try to avoid the word conflict, the minute you try to talk about this issue, there are ready-made accusations. And I know many people have been subject to these accusations. But at the same time, if you are using the right terminology, using factual narratives and referring to history and referring to right resources and sources of information, as you asked, Ezra, I think you are safe. But at the same time, people should remember that keeping their mouths shut and trying to get themselves isolated from this will not save them from their responsibility as a human being. Like, it's the faces and the names of the Palestinian children who've been killed in the month of May during this cycle of violence was published by Haaretz, Israeli newspaper. The guilt is so high. So I don't think any human being who had we in Arabic we call it damir hay, like alive, conscious, like someone who have really this feeling of humanity will never accept the silencing. And as I said, you can define yourself by referring to the facts, to the historical context, and using the right terminology.
So then if I may follow up quickly,
Sure.
What would be the best way to limit those who do say, it's complicated, game, set, match, I'm not talking about it. Not everybody has the privilege of taking a course with you or, at Laurier or at a university to learn what happens in the Middle East. So, maybe it's something we don't answer now, but just how do we, if it's an issue that people are saying, okay, it's complicated, how do we limit that? Because it is a conversation that has to be had. And what's very sad for me is that it takes such extreme events for us to be talking about this.
Exactly.
And that is very, very sad. I feel like that, this is not an exception, but how do we ensure that the conversation is had so that A, people are not saying it's complicated and that's it, and B, when maybe it's not in the news?
Yeah, I think actions like this, inviting people who can talk about it and create awareness, are very useful. I am personally involved in a community-based group that aims to create awareness about what's going on in in historical Palestine, Israel, and occupied Palestinian territories. I am happy to keep the board informed of our activities, where we invite scholars like Elan Pepe, Jeff Helper, Michael Lynch. We had them for the last 3 months to talk about what's going on, best way forward. For example, last Saturday, we invited Jeff Helper. I think most of you remember that we had Jeff interview as a signed video to watch. Jeff webinar talked about an inspiring vision to end this violence by calling for the fight for building one democratic state solution for Palestinian and Israelis to be able to live together in one political entity and enjoy equal rights. I think creating awareness and talking about these things and educating ourselves is very important. So I know you are a member, you are an active member of your community. So if you decide not to keep silent and talk about what's happening, if you decide not to be afraid of being accused with certain kind of like titles or stigma, I think that's the right way to do it.
Thank you so much. And as somebody who attended the webinar that you mentioned, I can certainly agree. Thank you so much.
No problem. No problem. Thank you, Ezra.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions from directors right now? If not, I can ask a couple of questions of myself.
Sure.
So I really appreciate you giving the board some real insight. I think one thing that we want to strive to do was to showcase students that the board is listening, and we want to make sure we understand the real history behind, both sides of conflict, but the issue, to really, take in, the best approach. And one advice I kind of want to ask that you maybe can help us is how should student leaders like ourselves address this issues like this, not just this specifically, moving forward, right? Stuff that are very contentious, and if if the an organization like ourselves decides to try and make a stance, it could result in some sort of organizational risk. But at the same time, we don't want to just remain silent, as I'm sure we just had that conversation about.
Yeah, I think representing the community of students and trying to avoid silencing certain members of the student just because they are members of certain community, focusing on the major issues rather than focusing on small issues that can create lots of noise and distraction from what's actually happening, focusing on the moral issues and focusing moral issues includes equality, justice, and fairness for all members of our community as students, as faculty, and a wider community in this country. What happened last week, the tragic events in London, Ontario, is a great example of how important the knowledge and creating awareness about diversity, equality, rights, and ability to live together with different backgrounds. I think this is very much important. The issue of the remaining of the indigenous children in BC, and the calls for lowering the flag, and many people consider it as colonial flag. All these things should be addressed in spaces like this, and students from different backgrounds should be offered equal right of representation. I think this is a way forward in the right direction. Andrew, you're muted.
I just realized that. No, thank you. That was a really great answer. And just to follow up on that one there too as well. Like how should we be able to make people like, you know, like not just ourselves, but also, you know, broader students more aware of these issues, like, you know, like we're making sure that we do the due diligence to understand the issue. But, you know, when we, you know, there's always the risk that when you try to output some sort of information to others, they might see it as you are being very biased, right? Like what's a way, like how if there is a situation where a student, you know, like ourselves, needs to address the body, what would you say would the best way to do that? Like if we want to tell them about this is some knowledge or resources or anything of that nature.
Yeah. This accusation of being biased or non-neutral, I think, sorry, but I find them insensitive sometimes when you are talking about years and years and years of oppression, years and years and years of denial, years and decades of criminal acts against certain communities. I think the best way to do that, and I will be repeating myself, is using the right kind of information, factual details, and visiting the history, and try to connect things together in order to look at the bigger picture. You can't understand and evaluate events like this related to huge conflict by looking at them from a narrow lens. You have to look at them from a historical context and historical perspective. So again, this will bring us back again to the information, the importance of knowledge, importance of information. I know the social media is a great tool, but at the same time, it can be risky and dangerous. So we need to use our knowledge in the right way, but at the same time, we should not accept being lazy, and we should share our knowledge with our community to help building real diverse community that can respect and accept members coming from different backgrounds. And I think we can avoid sensitivity, biased attitudes, or this language and terminology can actually look as useless when you have the right way, the right lens to look at things.
Thank you so much. And I have one last follow-up question.
Sure.
I am keeping very much aware of the agenda time. So now that you answered that, I wanted to know what about for the opposite end, for how do we help address like, you know, for some students who feel like we're not doing enough, like even after if we made sure to do our due diligence and to, you know, put out statements of like, you know, supports and like, you know, trying to get this knowledge out. How do you in your experience you know, respond to that?
Are you referring to, for example, the students who continue to ask for for more information about, for example, the university?
Not just that, like, and just in general, I guess, like, you know, who even after you do all these things, there's, if people want more, right, there should be a greater stance or something along those lines, right? Even so what would you recommend in terms of addressing that issue?
I think the more activities about creating awareness, the more engagement, the more discussion you have, bringing people who are informed and people who are ready to share their knowledge and bring those, I don't like to use the word biased, non-biased or neutral, because you cannot be neutral with these events, but at least they depend on factual background and historical context. I think this is the right way to do it. And again, Azra asked me, how can we get information? We share those sources of information. We share those links on webinars that invite scholars who can share their knowledge, years of research in these areas. I think knowledge is more available than any time before, but we have to use our time in the right way rather than focusing on small events here and there that can create tensions between people and do not add at all to our understanding of what's going on the ground.
No, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you answering not just my question, but also the other director's questions. In that case, since I don't see any other questions, I think that the board should give a huge round of applause to you.
Thank you for
such
having me.
an amazing presentation and honestly some great insights. So thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you very
Al-Mustafa.
much. Thank you.
Yeah. So
let's keep in touch.
Of course, and just to reiterate for the record, I will be following up on the director's request for more information on scholarly sources and the networks, as well as the community that you were mentioning before, supporting and trying to find the best pathway forward.
Perfect.
So,
thank you very much.
Awesome.
And good luck.
Thank you
good
so
luck for
much.
the board. Bye-bye.
Bye. And now, without further ado, I think we've listened to the institutional response, we've listened to history. I think this is the best ending to this will be from our Dean of Students, Adam Lawrence and Kate Bristol, to speak on the student support. So I'm so happy to invite them back against the board here and to speak upon this topic here. So welcome both of you, and you now have the floor.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey.
Andrew, you always make us feel so important when we come in here. You always, you're like our hype team. We definitely appreciate it.
We need it. I did think my kids just threw spaghetti at the back of my door when I closed it. So,
I mean, you guys have been here for almost every single step of my student union tenure. For a little background to the rest of the board, Dave saw me when I was just a lowly director in your shoes, and when I went to vice chair and now finally the chair. So it's been so they've watched my incredibly long but also enjoyable journey up the ranks.
Well, we very much love the student union team and the board. So today we're going to talk a little bit about resources, and we're going to share the conversations and the topics that sometimes keep Kate and I up at night around resources and how we communicate them. So Kate, do you want to start, and then we'll get into.
Yeah, I'm glad I got to catch the tail end of the last guest and hear what you all are diving into, because it's important and really hard work. And so I think, as Andrew mentioned, what Adam and I really try to focus on and stay in our wheelhouse on for you and for the rest of the student body is, how do we ensure we are keeping our spaces on campus safe, open, abiding by our principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and creating safe spaces for some of the really hard conversations to happen so that we can learn and grow and know more and do better. And so part of that, in, I would say, the heat of some of these big issues that are happening around us, sometimes what that looks like are some of the reactive supports that are available. Now, they may feel reactive to some folks, but ultimately they're here for all of our students. the way they always have been, but they get a bit more play in these, really tough circumstances. So for us, that runs everything from our wellness centers, the community building and student support in our centers for student equity, diversity, and inclusion. All of these are on both campuses. Our Office of Dispute Resolution and Sexual Violence Support. I don't know that, how many of you are aware of that group on campus. It's a really hard unit name, but they offer an amazing set of resources, I would say learning opportunities, trainings, and also support spaces for students. They often hold vigils and that sort of thing, and they work really closely with our Center for Student Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. You know what? I think Adam and I, and Student Affairs more broadly, also think of you as important partners, the Student Union, in providing student support. And I'll say support because it looks different than perhaps what happens out of our office, but it is important for us to continue to go forward and work together and ensure we are representing students in a good way and the student voice in a good way, even in these really, really tough times that are really hard to communicate effectively. Adam and my office and the Dean of Students offices on both campus also always are available for students to support them, whether it's a short-term or a long-term situation that they're navigating, and it might be affecting their academics, their financial situation, perhaps they're having trouble navigating campus systems, and ultimately, back to this context, making community connections. There's a large number of students who are seeking support and connection outside of the Laurier community. And that changes and evolves certainly as the issues that are happening in our, in our community and around the world, as those change. And so right now for us, some of that looks like our Center for Student Equity and Diversity and Inclusion teams leveraging some of their community resources like the Muslim Social Services of Kitchener-Waterloo, the Coalition of Muslim Women in KW, and there's some in Brantford as well, Brantford Mosque, the Muslim Association of Brantford, that sort of thing. And that changes, right? Whatever sort of community connection opportunity that may exist, we may be able to nurture those year round, but leverage them at different times when we know students may be really struggling, hurting, suffering from some grief, trauma, when the events that you've all been learning about are just so heavy and weighty. And that continues to be the ongoing work, quite frankly. Adam, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and a big part of the ongoing work. So Kate mentioned, some great resources that we have in our campus community. But our next step and our next gap that we're finding is how we're communicating these to our student body. And there's a few things we've been thinking about. So first of all, if you can imagine when you were in first year and something traumatic happens in our community, and there's a statement by the university and it says, as a resource, you can go to the wellness center. Well, what the heck does that mean? Like, what do you go to the wellness center for? Like, if you go there and say, I feel upset about this, what will happen? What's the process? And we're trying to determine, when we're communicating, what does it mean to communicate? If we're just posting these things, do students understand what the connection is to their own feelings, the situation, and what this service is? And to Kate's earlier point, we talk about the Office for Discrimination and Sexual Violence. Do people know how to access that? Do they know where it is? What if they access it? What's the follow-up they're going to get? So we need to be mindful of, are we sending emails? Is it websites? Is it Instagram? What is the forum that we're connecting to students? A little bit of the conversation before, are we remaining bipartisan? Are we offering a wide range of supports, or just the supports we feel are best tailored to the certain situation? And then, there has been discussions at other institutions, and we talked with our U of T partners about this. Are there specific students we're sending specific messages to? Is it a wide range? Is it a very big message? What are those supports? So for us, it's really coming down to, we feel confident that our services on campus are great, but we need to help students access those with the appropriate communication. And that seems to be a little bit of the barrier that we know students are facing. Of course, in our online environment, emails, what does that mean when we're back on campus, hopefully sooner rather than later? Do people even know where to go to make these connections? These are things that we need to walk through when we're offering that high level support for our students. And just to touch on what Kate said, and Kate's team, the Center for Student EDI team in Brantford or in Waterloo, has really reached out to get some very strong community-based supports. And we need to continue that journey of exploring what other supports we have in our communities. We have strong ties to our sexual assault support centers. We have strong ties to our mosques and our chaplains. But what are those other gaps? And we need to be doing more work to, Kate and I always say this, we need to start thinking about what the issues are going to be before the issues arise, and make sure that we've built those connections in both Kitchener, Waterloo, and Brantford. So that's where we're at, Kate. I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to add. There's lots of work to be done. We have great teams that are exploring this work, but we always work with, PJ and Phil and Ian around these topics as we explore what these supports are going to be. And this is a time as students come back and as more social issues are becoming topics of conversation. We need to be prepared to make sure that we have those supports in place so people feel safe and healthy to keep having those conversations.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would add around the communication of these resources, and this remains a challenge, whether we're, in the midst of something really significant or not, is that we try to do our best to connect with the student groups, clubs, whatever may exist, that capture students who may, find themselves in experiencing certain things, so that we can connect with those leaders of those areas so that they know specifically, because we know that, like many of you, it's often the upper year student leaders who are carrying a lot of the burden in supporting their peers and supporting one another in these situations. And so it's a small group of student leaders, but it feels really important to Adam and I to make sure that those groups know what's available so that they can leverage it or they can share it with their group, their club, or their constituents. Part of that also is easy to do for some of our groups because we have a multi-faith resource team. I'm not sure if you are all aware, filled with different multi-faith chaplains. And each of those chaplains are engaged differently on campus, and it's definitely, their work is evolving. It has evolved over the last decade, and it's probably on the cusp of changing again. But those chaplains provide really important and, I would say, specialized support for students who feel like that's a good fit for them. The ultimate goal is that we have multiple services, supports, and resources. So not so that every student's going to use each one. You're going to likely, depending on the situation, feel like one is a better fit to you in a certain situation. It might be training, it might be a webinar, but the next time you might be suffering differently through an event or something potentially harmful. And that's then a chance to leverage something else. And what we want students to know is that they can and they should, and we hope that they will reach out to us in those moments, even just to say, we're really disappointed this is happening. How can I help? What can I do? Or sometimes it's, I don't know where to go. Can you help me figure it out? And we can do that with students as well. Our teams are well staffed to do that. So like Adam said, I think going forward, we'll forever be trying to build bridges and great connections with our community resources, because quite honestly, it's really difficult as an educational institution to be all of those things to every single student. But we're trying really hard to make sure that we're looking after every dimension of a student's wellness in some shape or form. And if a student's need grows beyond that, that we have a great place that we feel really comfortable with, that we can suggest to move the student further and beyond so that they can get what they need. I don't know if that's what you were looking for on the heels of the great learning before, but I know Adam and I would take any questions you've got.
I think for sure it's given a lot of good insight in terms of like the resources we have. And I think it's a great, as I said at the beginning, I think a good ending to, just like, the resolution. And this is what, like, the university and us as the students union can help do to help support students. And I think you really touched on that really nicely. But in that notion, I think it would be a good segue to open up the floor for any questions. Do any directors here have any questions for Adam and Kate? Yes, Vice Chair Stevie.
Hi, as I mentioned in the previous presentation, sometimes it takes, and I think Adam touched on this, like a reaction for people to know about resources. So if, I understand sometimes in a course outline, there will be resources listed, but will we see a change in how resources are communicated when they are not in reaction to something as a way to further these initiatives?
That's like music to our ears.
Yeah. Yeah, Ezra, we had some success this past year during COVID. So we had our teams put together a very large document of resources in all of our communities throughout Ontario where students were living. So what we were seeing was, we had student, Jane Smith call from Milton saying that she had some questions around gendered violence. Well, then we were able to make a connection in Milton with that resource. So being able to provide students with resources where they were, huge success, Ezra. And we heard back from frontline staff and faculty being like, oh my gosh, like this resource is incredible. How do we share it? So with that information, we thought, okay, we have all this information. How do we get this into the hands of students? So there has been a few discussions around, could we utilize My Learning Space? Could we, because you're right, oh, this is recorded. I will say that I don't always love the resources that are on the syllabus, like syllabi. I feel sometimes that they're generic, which is fine, like we need to know these, but there's always that, what's that other information? And some of you in your classes may see some of the slides from wellness education. Nathan, bringing that information to your class, how do we bring the information about more resources to you? Also coinciding with making sure that as many people on our campuses have access to those resources so that we can connect students to where they need to go.
I hope that answers your question, Vice Chair Stevie.
It does. And as I'm currently the SBAC coordinator, and my outlook as of right now is it doesn't hurt to know. You don't have to ever speak to me. You don't have to, you don't have to use me. It just, you can't unknow something once you know it. So if students know about SRAC the same way they know about other resources, they can't unknow about it. And if they need it 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, it's there for them. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really important in that vein is that Adam and I spend quite a bit of time trying to ensure our student-facing staff across campus in any unit and our faculty know what those resources are. So when a student says, when a student's first point of contact may be, a contract teaching faculty in philosophy, that person has the resources at the ready and can make a strong referral. Because we do know, Ezra, you're right, when we can drip these resources on students throughout their entire time at Laurier, they begin to sink in and you feel more comfortable using them when you're a bit more familiar with them. But communicating to our students is a really, really tough thing to do. Adam and I joke that when we get in a room with students, we poll them on how they want their information. And I bet we would have a split poll if we had one here. Some say, oh yes, My Learning Space all the way, put it there, that burning notification sign, we'll read it. And then the other half will go, no, not there, just email, email's fine. So what we're trying to do is find a really good balance of social, My Learning Space, likely for the things I would say that we kind of move up the ladder in terms of significance for students who may really need important information at their fingertips and maybe in a more confidential way. That would be in My Learning Space. Another exciting initiative that we hope will help, particularly for this fall, because the fall is going to look different than what we've had for the last year and a half, is kind of a peer navigation team that will physically be on campus, helping most notably our first and second year students who've never been on campus before. And they're going to be sort of boots on the ground, spread across both campuses. They're going to have kind of also a stationary home, also likely in the concourse and One Market in Brantford, that we're hoping are going to really help students simply wayfind in the first month. And then that will extend, that will probably start to shake out differently as the term goes on. But nabbing students and being like, hey, I can walk you to Service Laureate. And did you know you can find these things here? So a lot more in-person stuff that feels really important as we come out of COVID. So hoping that will help students leverage some resources differently.
Awesome. I did see Director Bothwell, your hand was up. Do you still have a question?
Well, just like super quickly, this is really not so important, but you mentioned like adding the resources in the syllabus. And just something I wanted to point out, because I am on Foot Patrol, is that the information on the syllabus for Foot Patrol was not accurate this year because Foot Patrol is an online service. So I just wanted to make sure that if going forward, it would be the correct.
I think, yeah, Victoria. So I'll be honest with you. That is a concern we have.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Ian. Ian, I think our student senators have access to that committee, right? That looks at, because I think, Victoria, I think there's a Senate, I could be wrong here. I believe there's a Senate student committee that looks at this. Is that correct, Ian?
Okay.
If you know.
Cool.
Yeah, I can just briefly mention that Aaron and the University Affairs team are in the process of reviewing that material and positioning some advocacy efforts with PJ. So that's something that you'll be getting some updates on in the future. But the problem that you've identified, Victoria, was kind of what prompted that. So that's in the works.
Awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to point that out in case it was missed. So yeah, that's not really a big deal, but thanks.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Director Loachi.
Hi, Adam and Kate. Thank you so much for coming in. So my question to you, so as we're discussing providing resources through MyLS, would it be possible to almost create like a class tab? So for board training, we have our SUBOD tab that we can just click on and go to. Would it be possible to create something like that for resources? So kind of have like a wellness tab and then different resources listed under content or in the news feed.
Great idea.
Yeah, I love that. So I teach a couple of courses. I love my learning space. Like I think it's awesome. I don't know if other people love it as much, but yeah, I definitely think we've talked about that with our wellness team, our wellness education team around a tab. And I think that is a wonderful idea of having those resources right at everyone's fingertips. That's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. I think the first one, aside from the wellness education, and which is really learning how to access wellness supports, there's I think the anticipation that there will be another hub on your My Learning space for our what don't have another name at this point, but around our human rights supports. So that's around gender and sexual violence, harassment and discrimination, that sort of thing. And I think to Ezra's earlier question, it feels really important for that to be really easily accessed in a confidential way for students, rather than sort of wandering the halls looking for something that they're not willing to perhaps disclose to a total stranger while trying to find the space. So I think that's a great idea.
Thank you so much for answering my question. I guess my follow-up question would be, would it be possible to kind of create a what's it called? A confidential chat feature in MyLS for students to access wellness educators and other resources. So for a lot of people right now who are in therapy, it's online. So they're using, I believe it's called telehealth. And that creates a confidential waiting room, and then your therapist will let you in when it's your time to speak.
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll look into that. so Kate and I do oversee our wellness services. So I've been pretty immersed in telehealth. I think Phil's going to talk about a new initiative, or he will now because I prompted him. Sorry, Andrew. I'm answering these and directing people without your guidance. But yeah, I think that's
Robert
great.
rules out the window.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
No,
those
it's
are great
okay.
recommendations. And I think the idea with, that is, what can we put at students' fingertips, where they are, where they exist, and where can we do that in a positive way?
Yeah, but I think that's a good segue for you, Phil, if you can touch upon that.
Yeah, one of the things that we've gotten approval for through the Student Affairs Advisory Council, of which Kate and Adam and PJ, myself, although I don't have a vote, I'm just there. Anyways, not important. They've approved that all students at Laurier, graduate and undergraduate alike, will have access to a program in the fall, so starting in September, called Empower Me, which I believe actually has a function, and we can confirm whether that's true or not, because I may be speaking out of turn on that. But it's basically an enhanced tool to help the wellness centers on both our campuses engage and help and support our students in a way that has historically not been available to them. And it's going to be available to all students 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. In most countries around the world, being able to access Canadian resources for mental health supports, etc. Once we kind of sign that contract, we're going to work with our wellness centers to get everybody on board, and then ultimately prepare an update brief with better information than this particular verbal update for the board. So likely that will come at the July, I want to say the 8th meeting, whenever the meeting is in July.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that is awesome. Thank you, Phil, for that. Do we have any other questions? If not, I have a question myself. I just want to ask, and this might be confidential, so you don't have to all answer it. But ever since the initial instance regarding the student TikTok, and then the subsequent news of the discovered Aboriginal children, and then the attack on London, are you aware if there has been an uptick in the usage of student services for support? I just want to know.
Good question.
Because I want to know, because that would come answer the other point about like addressing this gap of information, if there is, right?
There's been a significant uptick in, I would say, participation in some of these support spaces, particularly through our Centers for Student Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I would say that's very intense, and with our Indigenous Student Center as well. That's feels kind of logical, because they have held some support spaces and arranged and coordinated them, brought in some external wellness supports for different communities of students. So I think in that regard, yes, we see like a huge uptick there. There's also, I think, for a lot of students who've had or made great connections there, they're well in tune. They have a great newsletter that goes out that lists all sorts of resources. So students who are engaged or on that listserv are getting a lot of information from some of the student groups and leadership in that department. From a wellness center perspective, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's generally quieter this time of year, so we could absolutely look into it. But for sure, Andrew, the places that have done segmented, targeted support circles and that sort of thing, they're seeing great participation. Adam, can you think of anything else?
I think that was good, and I think, to Kate's point, we've seen an increase in students accessing support these past 14 months, general support. So those numbers have increased exponentially. And to Kate's point, some of that is, we want to reach out to students. So our Center for Student EDI has been very purposeful in reaching out to students to say these supports exist. We want you to access them. So, Andrew, I would never say it's never been a burden with an increase in student support. We want students to be, accessing the supports, and it just really goes to Ezra's initial point that we keep going back to. We need to make those supports available so that all students have access and can make sure that they're aware and be filtered to the appropriate places.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for addressing that. And I think that, even like, to kind of echo what Vice Chair Sneedy said, that although we hate to have these extreme events and tragedies, to have a voice for discussion of these things, now that it has been, I think this is a good time for us as a board to, really continue the ongoing, advocacy for these supports. And it's a perfect timing too, in relation to President Yamilov's mental health campaign as well, I think. So trying to make sure that we can get all these, ongoing, just, I want to say, I don't want to say the word marketing, but just like, letting these students know. And I think what the board will do is, I guess, follow up with you and just to kind of get a better idea of where this gap is and if there's anything that we can do to help fix that from a strategic point of view. Yeah. But other than that, I really, really appreciate your presentation. Can we give a huge round of applause for Adam, Kate, for volunteer time, especially at this somewhat more late hour. It's been always a pleasure to invite you guys, and thank you again for the great information as always.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, everyone.
Stay
Thanks
well.
for all your work.
Okay, hope you have a wonderful day. Okay, everyone. So that concludes all of our guest speakers, and I hope that you found them extremely informative. Next, moving on to our, we are running a little bit behind, but we have the final report for the Direct Inspection Committee, EL number 1. So I'll let the chair of that committee take it away from here.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I present to my fellow directors, the board, Executive Limitation number 1 policy, Direct Inspection Committee report. The committee met on one occasion, and I'm just going to keep this brief here just for the sake of time because we're already going to be over time. But basically, we took a look at the policy, whatnot, and the committee felt there was no need to make any changes. And as a result, there were no recommendations arising from this committee to the board. Thank you. If there's any questions, I'll happy to answer.
Okay, perfect. Is there any questions that any directors want to address to Director Vale? If not, then can I get a motion on the table to adopt the report for the from the Direct Inspection Committee for EL 1? Motion by Director Lorchi, seconded by Director Shandok. Would you like to speak to your motion? Any discussion on the matter? If not, then all those in favor, Director Bothwell,
I approve.
Director Shando,
I approve.
Director Del Giudice,
I approve.
Director Iqbal,
I approve.
Director Loachi,
I approve.
Director May,
I approve.
Director McCarthy. Director McCarthy? I will come back to him. Director Mohammed, I believe she had to leave, so Director Singleton.
I approve.
Director Vale.
I approve.
In this case, you would abstain because it is your committee.
I wouldn't say it's a conflict, but I'll abstain.
Yes. Thank you. And Vice Chair Sneedy?
I approve.
Oh, were you on this committee? Oh, sorry.
Director
Oh, my
Chandok was.
apologies, Director Shandok. You were on this committee. I mixed them up. You will have to abstain in this case.
Actually, I believe he seconded as well, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Seconding is fine to the motion.
Sure, yeah.
Yes. So my apologies. So Director Shandok, you abstain, correct?
I abstain.
Yeah. Thank you. And going back to Director McCarthy. Okay, he is not there, so the motion passes 7-0 to 2 with Director McCarthy's vote absent. Next, we can move on to the Direct Inspection Committee final report for GP2E. So I will hand it off now to Chair of that committee, Vice Chair Sneedy.
So again, going to keep it relatively brief, but for GP2E, struck on May 14th, and we decided that no recommendations were needed. So I sent the document back to the chair, and just like the previous committee, no changes were made.
Okay, perfect. Does any directors have any questions to Vice Chair Sneed? As I see none, can I get a motion on the table to drop the final report from the District Inspection Committee GP2E? Motion by Director Del Giudice, seconded by Director Loachi. Would you like to speak to your motion? Any discussion on the matter? As I see none, all those in favor, Director Bothwell,
I approve.
Director Shando,
I approve.
Director Del Giudice,
I approve.
Director Iqbal,
I approve.
Director Loachi,
I approve.
Director May,
I approve.
Director McCarthy. I will come back to him again. Director Symington,
I approve.
Director Vale,
I abstain.
yes, and Vice Chair Sneed.
I abstain.
Going back to you again, Director McCarthy. Yes, he's absent again. The vote passes 7-0 with Director McCarthy absent. Now we can move to our final report for the Ad Hoc Board Social Media Governance Committee. So I'll now pass on to Chair of that committee, Director Loachi.
Sorry, let me just pull this document up here. So the Ad Hoc Social Media Governance Committee was struck on May 14th, 2021, with the mandate to review and assess the parameters which a proper board social media committee would be set up in terms of efficacy, evidence, and compliance to GP number 2C3C. So the committee makes the following recommendations. Motion for the creation of a social media committee consisting of 2 chairs, 1 from each campus, and 4 general members, including Chair Dang. Positions will be held for a single term as a director. The chairs will be the only password holders. Posts will be decided and approved in advance by the board as a whole. Posts will be created by the Ad Hoc Social Media Committee. A calendar is to be created to prevent an overload of posts. The main goal of the committee would be to connect and engage with students to provide transparency and an increase in voter turnout. A link tree is to be included in all board social media account bios. The social media committee is to have regular meetings with Megan LeCousier. And for budgetary compliance, the committee recommends to the board budgetary oversight in regards to the possible purchase of a Hootsuite closer to election period. That would be at a cost of $49 US. As well, under budgetary oversight would be ownership linkage giveaways. And in regards to GP number 2C3C, the committee makes the following recommendation. No individual may make a post on behalf of the board. All posts and captions are to be approved by the social media committee and Chair Dang. It should be noted that these are recommendations, not a binding motion. And it should also be noted that the committee recognizes all other policies and evidence relating to GP number 2C3C.
Okay, thank you, Director Loachi. Does the board have any questions in regards to this? Yes, Director Vale.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Director Loachi is chair of the Ad Hoc Social Media Governance Committee. I just have a number of questions. I guess some clarifications here. So, and maybe actually through you, Mr. Chair, you can confirm this. I want to confirm, I believe quorum for our board is set at 2/3. Is that correct?
I believe
Or is
so.
it 50%? It's been a
Ian,
while
could
since I checked
you
the bylaws.
double check that for me? If possible, what's quorum for the board?
Yeah, 2/3. I'll give you the constitutional reference in just a second.
Perfect. No, that's good. I just wanted to, because where I was going to go is if it was 50%, then that could potentially pose some issues with having half the board on a meeting in terms of, needing a secretary and whatnot, in my view, and minutes and notice and that. But in any event, the other, I guess, questions or concerns I maybe have is, so under the budgetary compliance, you're referring to like ownership linkage giveaways, as well as the recommendation, voter turnout. The issue I have with these is, in my view, these already fall within the mandate of other existing board committees and established under policy, like I think ownership linkage and whatnot. So I'm just concerned that we're getting into a bit of overlap here.
Yeah,
if you'd be able to kind of comment.
I can comment that unless Director Lochi, you would like to take the mantle on this.
I'll let you go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think so. Some of the recommendations here were more from I believe from the broad discussion, and other members of this committee can come and chime in if I'm misinterpreting the words, but it was more for like goals and sets to be mined, because the committee, when trying to strike a ad hoc committee, certain goals must be achieved, right? Like I think the goals were to have the responsibility to create the posts within that, but then also to achieve like what is the reason for that, to increase the broader board social media I guess awareness, and through that would be resulting into the voter turnout, because that was kind of what the initial idea of having the Instagram account was built in back in last year when it was first enacted.
Right, and then I guess the other piece I have here for your the policy recommendation under GP 2C 3C. So are you looking to add that? Is that, or to the policy, or what are you looking to do with that? It's not really entirely clear. Are you looking to, is this going to be like added to the existing, or what do we?
Oh no, there's no change to policy itself. This is just in terms of compliance to the policy,
right?
If that makes sense.
Right.
So there's
Now
no change.
The issue from my perspective here is, under the policy, I believe the board is, in my view, the board as a whole has to technically approve this. When you're saying approved by the social media committee and Chair Dang, the board as a whole has to, take a position on the matter. We can't have like half the board or this committee acting on behalf of the board, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think the idea of this is that the board as a whole would still require approval, but I think it's the responsibility of creating the post, right, would then would fall into it. I think the idea of this committee is not to take responsibility away from directors, but I think trying to gather directors who have the keenest and most experience in creating posts and put them into one roof, and then create some structure, and then have some communication. Because as you can imagine, with the multiple releases of statements, and there has been discussions with that, and I think a proper understanding of that, as well as some consistent structure, would add to that clarification as well, and avoid constant discussions.
Sure, no, that certainly clarifies my questions in terms of kind of the overlap and whatnot. So thank you.
A reminder to the board that this is not a binding motion. This is simply a recommendation that the committee is staying. I can also speak to a discussion that I had with our full-time resources, stating that the committee size, although recommended to be at 6 people, is quite large. With the most comparable reference is the ownership linkage committee, which only holds a membership of 5 members, including the chair themselves. So that is a potential room for discussion. Like, are we okay with having a committee of this size, or do we want something a little bit smaller? That's just another note that I just want to make for transparency's sake. Yes, again, Director Vale.
Yeah, I guess just to comment, and I mean, obviously, and as you mentioned, this is really just a recommendation, not about it. I personally think that the committee size is a bit large. I think typically when you have, like, for instance, you have half the board on this, and seeing as these posts are going to have to be approved by the board anyway, I think that having maybe 4 or 5 people total max, I think would be really good. Because it sounds from what you were clarifying is really it's more action item or action oriented committee where they're kind of developing these posts and that. So I don't really see the need to have 6 directors sitting us, because I feel like it's just things are gonna get bogged down, if you will, otherwise.
No, that's a fair enough point. Okay. Is there any other questions regarding this? Yes, Director Bothwell.
I would just add to that, the reason why the size is so large is that I believe that everyone on the board has their own specialties when it comes to social media posts and social media engagement. Like I personally am a social media, like a digital marketing director at Communitech. So a lot of us have our own experiences that we could bring together. And I'm not saying that we're like overtaking anything, but I think when it comes to like making posts and like working together on Canva, the more like input, the merrier. And then we'd still come to the board afterwards and like approve of posts. I think it's just more sheer numbers of if people don't have time to make posts, and it's not just putting the responsibility onto one person instead of like, it's kind of just like splitting responsibility more or less, not really like saying it's the whole board doing this, if that makes sense.
You know, that's no, that's fair enough. Like, and by I'm not trying to say I'm against these, but these are just more, you know, considerations that come to mind for me that I, as a director, I want to, before we embark on like a committee like this.
Yeah. But I hope that that addresses, like, I mean, for sure, the size committee is something that the board can discuss, and what would what is the kind of like direction the board's leaning in towards? Are they satisfied with this size, or would they rather prefer something a bit smaller, like maybe the same exact size as the ownership linkage committee?
I think the size of ownership linkage is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If needed, I think other directors can contribute.
I think so too. I mean, I think that the way that this is going to work, to give some reference, is going to work quite like the ownership linkage ad hoc committee. Everyone is technically speaking on that. It's just that the ad hoc committee is just a group of directors who are going to take a more hands-on approach and in trying to come up and actually plan these events. Yes, Executive Director Phil.
Yeah, I might suggest that because it's an ad hoc committee, like the size, while it is girthy, we don't know if it'll work. So there's no, just because you start off and say, yeah, this is going to be a committee of 6 people, it may prove itself in a term, like one semester, that that doesn't work. And then the board can always review that and redetermine the size of it, or make a recommendation moving forward to next year if it ends up being a standing committee, that the size be reviewed. Like I agree. I think it's too big. That's a lot of chefs in the kitchen, so to speak. Yeah. But I mean, you don't know until you try, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, for me, I could definitely speak on experience that might be the case, right? Director Vale.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if nobody else has any comments, I'm prepared to put a motion forward to, I guess, sort of adopt, you know, everything is presented with the caveat that we sort of do this as kind of a pilot for, say, maybe 6 months or to the end of the fall term, and just kind of see how it goes. And, you know, or do we have people who are we getting enough people wanting to be on this committee, even first and foremost? Because do we have, you know, 6 people, well, 5, I guess, including yourself, who even actually want to be on this as well? So, and then kind of revisit it to see, you know, what maybe should we change, and kind of revisit it then. I don't know if that, how the other directors feel.
No, I think that's a good point. I guess we can kind of open that for discussion. Sorry, Director Bothwell, I did see your hand up there. Did you still want to speak?
I was just gonna say, like, yeah, I think that's, I mean, I think if we put it on a trial and error basis, even if we just try it for this whole year, like as Kiana was saying, we're just gonna have like a 1 term per director, I guess. So even if we see how it goes until the fall and decide to renew it, but in terms of interest, I know like all of us that were on the like the committee that came up with this plan, I think all of us want to continue. So I think there is definitely enough interest. Unless people decided in the past like few days that they've changed their mind, but
no, for sure. I think you know, we can make it the at like, since it is an ad hoc committee, we do have that wiggle room to put like to actually reassess its efficacy, or so we could do it either to, as someone mentioned, the end of the fall term, or we can even just do it to the end of the spring term. We still have 2.5 months, you know, to kind of like, you know, play test this and then figure out what the best structure is. Director Vale.
I know I put forward a motion, but just a quick point of clarification, I guess, for somebody from the committee, perhaps Director Loichi as chair. So in the recommendation to the board, positions will be held for a single term as director. By term, are you referring to an academic term, or like a term is in 1 year as a director? I'm just trying to get what you sort of your intention with that was.
So when when writing the recommendations, I did have in mind the full term as a director, but I'm not opposed to adjusting it to be to an academic term.
Okay, no, I didn't have an issue. I just more wanted a clarification in terms of what reference in term you meant by term there.
I'm more than happy to change that in the motion itself once we get to it.
I believe I put a motion on the floor.
Yeah, there is another point that I do want to quickly make before we get to that. And we still have some other directors who have some questions. Director Bothwell.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. Whoops.
No problem. Okay, in this regard, I just want to clarify something on one point in the recommendation, which is having regular meetings to coordinate the strategy with the Director of Market Communications, Megan. That would be going through the chair and communicating with the president and the full-time staff to do that. So members of the committee would, just like in any other circumstance, would kind of use the position of the chair as a main communication there. The point of that line is just to make sure that, as you know, as I already stated in the May meeting, I'm already in communication with Megan to help get some of the board social media going, and in return for that, we would help boost, both of our platforms. So I think it's just always a good idea to just keep each other on some sort of meeting to have this open lines of communication, the structure of which I can have a deeper discussion with Ian to make sure it's following the best lines of policy. Yes, Director Loichi.
Yeah, so just as you're saying, growing both platforms, this would kind of be the main goal of the ad hoc social media committee, meeting with Megan for her expertise and input on this is important. And as Kate and Adam were saying, it's important that we're communicating with students and reaching them. So
yeah.
This social media committee would be focused on that, and especially increasing voter turnout.
Yeah, and just a final point to touch on there too as well. I believe some of that also came from discussion from dare I say the emergency meeting, to make sure that we do have unified responses on both sides too as well. So it doesn't seem like there's just two drastically different styles of information being posted online. With that being said, we can go back to, as I see no question, go back to Director Velez. You want to put in motion.
Yeah, so the motion I put forward was basically to, I guess, adopt the recommendation sort of as presented, with the caveat being it comes back to, or the board can consider and kind of see how it's working at the end of the fall term. So maybe January meeting or something like that. In other words, and then do we want to make any changes? Do we want to keep going, or that sort of thing?
Let's see. I guess we can have discussion on the matter. Or Director Bothwell, are you trying to second the motion?
No, I just want to say something about it. I just think I think it's a bad idea for us to stop this in January, because that's peak election season. And I think we should go until the end of the academic year. I'm really against stopping this in January, even reviewing it in January, because that's in the middle of elections, and that's when we want to be consistent with our social media. So I think shaking up the ad hoc committee in the middle of election season is not a good idea.
I'm prepared to amend my motion to have it go to the end of the year, and then I guess with the understanding that, if the committee and what the board felt, then we can just revisit it as maybe needed.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So that
I presume there'll be regular reporting to the board from the committee, correct?
Yeah.
So in which case, then we can address it then. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a better idea. I just think, if we were to shake it up during election season, that would probably not be good for our engagement, but I'm on board with that.
So just a clarification, that would be the end of December, correct?
No, that would be as in the April 30th.
April, oh, so April 30th, so that would be one entire academic year then, right?
Yes,
Um,
with the understanding that that obviously there's going to be regular reporting, and then thus as a board will be discussing sort of the updates from the committee on a regular basis, and if needed, we can make modified committee.
I
at
see.
that point.
I'm sure that just let me double check with Ian. So if the committee is struck with 6 members and some reporting occurs, realizing that maybe a different number of directors might be necessary, we can just simply have a motion to just change that, or just maybe dissolve that committee and move it to a different new version of the committee, or how would the best way to do it?
I mean, it's an ad hoc committee, so the board's free to kind of tinker at will throughout the course of the year if changes are required.
Okay, I assumed as much, but I want to make sure, since this is new territory that we're delving into, everyone. But okay, in that regard, can I get, sorry, could you please repeat your motion, Director Vale, for the record?
Sure. So my motion is to adopt the recommendations of the ad hoc social media governance committee report as presented. And we can put it in the motion or not, but more or less that the board can review the committee on an ongoing basis through reporting.
Okay,
To the board.
motion by Director Vale, seconded by Director Bothwell.
Wait, I'm not
Oh,
seconding.
not
it. That's
seconding
one
it.
question.
Another question, yes.
By reporting, do you just mean like us like reporting what type of posts you want us like that we're planning to post? Because that was kind of in the original plan anyways.
Yeah, I guess it would be more reporting on what's going on in the committee kind of thing. Like pretty well any standard committee would kind of report back
Yeah,
to the board on
okay.
what's going on. If that makes like nothing out of the ordinary, in other words.
Okay. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if you like wanted anything more than that, but that's fine.
So for example, if there was something to do directly with my relationship in terms of with Megan and marketing and the request that I made to her, I would put that in the comments of the chair and CGO. And then depending on how this committee would like, we can either have that during my comments or create a completely separate section on updates from the committee during future agenda packages. Is that a good clarification for both of you? Okay, perfect. So I guess we're maintaining the same motion. So that was motion by Director Vale, seconded by Director Bothwell. Would you like to speak to your motion? As I see, would you like, is there any discussion on the matter? As I see none, all those in favor, Director Bothwell,
I approve.
Director Shandok.
I approve.
I believe.
Yeah, I abstain. Sorry.
Sorry, yes.
Well, wouldn't I be able to approve because they like changed the motion actually?
But it's still, but you still sound the committee. The report is still being approved. Director Shandok.
I approve.
Sorry, since you did something, you also abstain as well.
Oh, abstain.
Yes. Director Del Giudice.
I approve.
Director Iqbal.
I approve.
Director Loachi.
I abstain.
Director May.
I abstain.
Director McCarthy.
I approve.
Director Symington.
I approve.
Director Vale.
I approve.
Vice Chair Seaman.
I approve.
Motion passes 5-0 to 4. Okay, so now that the committee has been struck, we can get on to the next agenda item. My apologies, everyone, for having the meeting run a little bit late. So now we can go to the committee elections for this ad hoc board social media committee. So as discussed, there will be the committee membership will consist of the chair, which is myself, as well as 5 other directors, at least one from Brantford, to act as the chair for that campus. So the floor is open for nominations. Yes, Director Loachi.
I nominate Director Bothwell.
Director Bothwell, do you stand?
Yes.
Okay. And Director Bothwell,
I nominate Director Loichi as a chair.
Director Loichi, do you stand?
I stand.
Yeah, in this case, it would not be for chair, but as a membership on the committee, but yes.
Oh.
But all good. Thank you. Vice Chair Sneedy,
I'd like to nominate Director Shando.
Director Shandok, do you stand?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Any other nominations? We still have 2 spots. Director Vale.
I'd nominate, I guess, Director May, seeing I think we'll need somebody from Brantford.
Director May, do you stand?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more. In this case, this can be from either campus. Director Loichi.
I nominate Director Del Judy.
Okay, Director Del Giudice, do you stand?
I do.
Okay. Is there any other nominations? If there are none, then can I get a motion on the table to have Director Bothwell, Director Loichi, Director Shandok, Director May, and Director Del Giudice to be to the acclamation to the ad hoc board social media committee. A motion by Director Vale, seconded by Director Iqbal. Would you like to speak to your motion? Is there any discussion on the matter? As I see none. All those in favor, Director Bothwell.
I abstain.
Thank you. Director Shando.
Abstain.
Director Del Giudice.
I abstain.
Director Iqbal.
I approve.
Director Loichi.
I abstain.
Director May.
I abstain.
Director McCarthy. Director McCarthy.
I approve.
Thank you. Director Symington.
I approve.
Director Vale.
I approve.
And Vice Chair Sneedy.
I approve.
Motion passes 5-0 to 5. Moving on, next is the Direct Inspection Committee EL2C. So this will act like the one from last term. So the committee will consist of the chair, which is myself, as well as 2 directors, regardless of campus. Now we're opening the floor to nominations. Anyone want to be nominated? I highly recommend a new director be nominated, as this is a great opportunity to not just spend time with myself, but also to learn about some of the interesting policy lines that govern our board. Anyone? You know this awkward silence is going to be recorded onto the minutes, right?
I would like to nominate Director Vale.
Director Vale, do you stand?
Sure.
Sure. Okay, Director Vale. Any other directors? As again, I remind, I would highly recommend a new director to be standing. Director Vale, yes. Sorry,
Oh, sorry. Was I muted? Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay. Sorry, I nominate Director Sinidi or Vice Chair Sinidi.
Vice Chair Sinidi, do you stand?
I do.
Okay. Is there any? Okay. Is there any other nominations on the table here? As I see none, can I get a motion on the table for Director Vale and Vice Chair Sinidi to be acclaimed for the acclamation to the Direct Inspection Committee EL2C. Motion by Vice Chair Sinidi, seconded by Director Vale. Would you like this? Oh, okay. Would you like to speak to your motion? Any discussion on the matter? I see none. All those in favor, Director Bothwell? Oh, she left, my apologies. Director Shandok,
I approve.
Director Del Giudice,
I approve.
Director Iqbal,
I approve.
Director Loachi,
I approve.
Director May,
I approve.
Director Symington.
I approve.
Oh, my apologies. Also Director McCarthy,
I approve.
Director Vale,
I abstain.
Vice Chair Sneedy.
I abstain.
Motion passes 6-0 to 2. Okay, next, moving on, we have our final committee election, GP2G. Now, the floor is again open to nomination for 2 directors, regardless of campus. Director Vale.
Yes, I'd like to nominate Director or Vice Chair Sneedy.
Okay, Vice Chair Sneedy, do you stand?
I do.
Okay, any other nominations? Again, I highly recommend a new director to be nominated. Yes, Director Loachi.
I nominate Director Iqbal.
Director Iqbal, do you stand?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other nominations? As I see none, can I get a motion on the table for Vice Chair Sneedy and Director Iqbal's acclamation to the Direct Inspection Committee, GP2G? Motion by Director Del Giudice, seconded by Director Vale. Would you like to speak to your motion? Any discussion on the matter? As I see none, all those in favor, Director Shando,
I approve.
Director Del Giudice,
I approve.
Director Iqbal,
I abstain.
Director Loachi,
I approve.
Director May,
I approve.
Director McCarthy,
I approve.
Director Symington,
I approve.
Director Vale,
I approve.
and Vice Chair Sneedy.
I abstain.
Motion passes 6-0 to 2. So that concludes all our committee elections. Okay, now moving to new business and announcements. Yes, Executive Director Champagne.
I just want to make it aware, it was public information, so I'm sure it's out there, but just a reminder that the university has extended July 2nd as an extra day off for the staff of the university. So the university will be closed on Thursday, July 1st and Friday, July 2nd.
That sounds like music to my ears. Awesome news, awesome news. Any other announcements? If not, then I can go. Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Motion by Director Vale, seconded by Director Sneedy. Would you like to speak to your motion? Is there any discussion on the matter? So I see none. All those in favor, Director Shando,
I approve.
Director Del Giudice,
I approve.
Director Iqbal,
I approve.
Director Loachi,
I approve.
Director May,
I approve.
Director McCarthy,
I approve.
Director Symington,
I approve.
Director Vale,
I approve.
and Vice Chair Sneedy.
I approve.
Motion passes with unanimous consent. Thank you so much for attending this meeting, everyone. And I will reach out to all directors regarding their committee assignments. But thank you for your great patience. I know that this was a long meeting, but I'm really hoping that the entire board took away something really interesting and useful from this.